Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first of our 7-part webinar course, The Art of Successful Contract Management. Today we kick off with the topic, what is contract management? So let's get started. I'd now like to introduce you to our presenter, Grosvenor Management Consulting's Dr. Stefan Gassner. Stefan leads Grosvenor's procurement and contracting practice. He helps our clients transform their procurement function, manage high-stakes procurement projects, and improve their supply management. Stefan has trained over 300 people in the art of successful contract management. And he has a PhD in procurement and is also a lecturer for strategic procurement at the University of Technology in Sydney. So I guess you could say he's pretty passionate about all things procurement and contracting. So over to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Jade. Welcome everyone to this first webinar. It's, as Jade already alluded to, the first in a series of 7. And I know that some of you have signed up for all of the 7 and others are just looking and getting a feel of what this webinar might be able to provide to them, which is great. Before we get stuck in, I'll introduce to you our agenda for today. We've got about 45 minutes set aside for this today. You have ample opportunities to ask questions and to participate. This is actually the first time that we're running this as a webinar. We have run it as workshops many times, but not as a webinar. So I'm quite keen to see how the participation with you as the audience will actually work out and how that's all working technologically. Excellent. So here's our agenda that we prepared. So for today, the first one, what is contract management? We'll talk around expectations and reality when it comes to the performance of a service provider. We'll also talk about what is actually contract management, what does it entail, and what are the sort of benefits that you get from contract management. The next webinar will then cover how to set up a successful contract. So what can you do straight away when you put your contract together to set up the contract in a way that it can be managed successfully afterwards, and so that you really get the benefits out of the contract that you want to get out of the contract. Webinar 3 is around how you implement this contract. So what do you need to do to set up the relationship that really suits the contract, and what do you need to do during those first critical 3 months of a contract to implement it so that it really generates the benefits. There's certain traps that you want to avoid, and there's certain contract law fundamentals that we need to cover when it comes to managing contracts. That is the subject of webinar number 4. Because performance management is such an important part of contract management, we've actually allowed 2 webinars to cover performance management. So there's part 1, which is webinar number 5, and part 2, which is webinar number 6. We'll talk about why would you measure performance, how can you come up with a performance management framework, which is wider than just defining KPIs. And then once you have defined all of these performance management initiatives, how do you actually go about measuring them and managing them? Look, we all know that people are not perfect, organizations are not perfect, so things will go wrong throughout a contract as well. And what do you do when that happens, and how do you deal with, say, variations, with issues when they come along, and probably even with disputes when they come along. So that's webinar number 7. So that's what we've prepared. All of the webinars are about a month apart. They run for 45 minutes, and you can always log on and also get the recordings from each of those. Before we get stuck into it, I want to introduce to you the course book that we've prepared. So this is the course book, and for those of you who have paid for the whole series of webinars, you have already been given a copy of this. The idea of this is, the course book is, and I'll just quickly run through it a bit. You see it's a written narrative of what we're actually talking about here. It also has several exercises in it that you can then use at your own time to go through and sort of validate the sort of context that you have been given during the webinar. So for the people who have this, feel free to use it as you want. A lot of people use it as a reference guide sitting on their desk. All right, so the first slide here is why contract management, and I have brought to you this cartoon that probably explains a bit why contract management is so important. So what I'd like you to do is just have a read of this and then tell me which one is your favorite of these cartoons. My favorite, to be honest, is probably how the business consultant described it at the top right-hand corner, because that is obviously my daily business to do. And I've also seen that to be very, very truthful, what the view of our clients are at times. Another one that I really like is how the project was documented. A lot of people can associate with that as well. Are there any virtual hands risen at this time? I can't see anyone, so no one has a favorite. Feel free to use the questions pane if you want to share one with me. Look, the real key takeaway here from this slide is really the bottom right-hand corner. What the customer really needed was to the service provider to create a doll, right? But everyone involved in this project or in this contract has gotten it wrong. So some people, well, actually everyone got it wrong because they built a robot, and some people got that robot better than others, but everyone still got it wrong, right? And that then led to that the customer was billed exorbitantly high, and also that the support of the project wasn't really there. So I've just been using project and contract sort of synonymously. What you actually see is that contract management has a lot in common with project management. But it's a bit more complex than that. So it is a bit more complex because there's not just several people trying to achieve the one outcome, which is producing the doll. It's actually several organizations trying to achieve that one right outcome. Right? So communication plays a pivotal role in this, and also clear expectation setting. And this is what we'll explore throughout this webinar. Does any of this sound familiar to you? So normally how you become a contract manager is someone walks into your door of the office, hands over a contract to you and says, congratulations, you're now a contract manager, go for your life and get the most performance out of this contract that you can possibly get. That's great, right? But for you, it creates a lot of uncertainty. So there's no explanation of what is actually required. There's no formal training of how you monitor the service provider's performance. And there's certainly no phone number that you can call when you have a question. And the big issue for you is you just don't know what you don't know. So how do you actually get the performance out of the service provider? No one tells you. A lot of the feedback that I get from this slide is actually that people say, well, no one ever actually even walked in my office and gave me a contract because someone just said, well, there's a contract somewhere. No, please go get the most performance out of that contract. Well, you set yourselves up for failure from the beginning if that is the case. So if any of you are managing a contract and you don't have a copy of that contract, that's sort of your first action item. Make sure that you get a copy of the contract, have a good read of it, a good understanding of it, and then you can start managing a contract appropriately. All right, we already said that contract management is a lot about expectations. This sort of slide and the next slides talk to that. So you see at the beginning of a contract, the performance can either be high or low, right? And at the beginning of your sourcing process, of your procurement process, you really have an expectation that the performance is going to be probably somewhere in the middle between high and low. So you expect that the effort that you have to put in and that the effort that the service provider will put in are probably at this mid-range of the scale. And then you secretly hope that, and this is the dotted line here, at the time when the contract starts, that the performance will slowly improve over time. Reasons for that is you know that new technology will come online over the 5 years of the contract duration. You also know that they will get to know your organization better. You will get to know the service provider better. And as a result, you hope that the performance will steadily increase. So this is what we said on this slide, is the sort of future vision of what the performance should be in this contract. So through contract management stage, you hope that the performance will increase. And so everyone gets a bit excited at the beginning of a procurement process because they hope that the performance will be really good. Well, is reality the same? Well, probably not. Let's have a look. So usually you start the procurement process at about halfway through, you get the tender responses in, and you see this red line here is surely below the blue line. So that shows that there's a gap already between your expectations and what you now think you can actually get. You read the tender response and you have a bit of a moment to say, oh, is that all I'm going to get? Right? So tender responses are also sales related, so they still have quite a positive spin on what the expectations should be, because they obviously want to win the work. So what then happens after the contract commenced, you actually see that the actual performance is even lower than that. They promised you the world, they really wanted to win the contract. It was business development people that put the tender response together. They can't really fulfill, the people on the ground delivering the contract now can't really fulfill what they have promised to you in the tender response, and so the actual performance is even lower. If you now don't do something actively against that actual performance to bring it up to where your original expectations were, you'll see after about 3 months into the contract, your actual performance is even going to erode further. And then it's almost too late to do something about it. And here contract management comes in. So this disappointment gap between the eroded sort of performance and what your future vision was can be bridged using contract management. So the benefits of contract management really are, you want to make sure that that actual performance, before it starts dropping off even further, through active contract management will be brought up right to where your future vision was, or at least to the expectation that you had when you started the procurement. So we want to close the disappointment gap through contract management. We want to maximize the benefits that we thought we would get out of this contract when we started the sourcing process for the contract. We also want to minimize the risk, the operational risk, the risk of a supply shortage, for example, also reputational risk to our organization. We want to keep the provider honest. Mind you, this service provider has gotten in the door because they were assessed by us as being better than everyone else. So if we now don't hold them up to what they promised in their tender response, that's very unfair against everyone else who missed out on this contract. So it's only fair to the people who missed out to do contract management, so we keep this provider, the winning provider, honest. To be honest with you, contract management is actually not hard. A lot of it is very common sense. There's lots of support available everywhere, and these webinars is one of those instances. And it's also in your very best interest to do it because it makes you and the service provider both look good. So contract management should sort of be a no-brainer. That said, a lot of people struggle with it because it is just something that's added onto their daily work. So when the manager walked into your office, handed over the contract to you for management, what they didn't say is, please go manage the contract, and here is an extra 2 hours every day that you can spend on managing this contract. So it's a matter of prioritization, and what I want to get out of this webinar today is that, making sure that everyone is aware of the tools that are available and of the importance of contract management, and that you then also know how to prioritize your work and what you can do to make it as smooth as possible. By the way, if you do have any questions, just raise your virtual hand or put something in the questions pane. I'm more than happy to keep this interactive. Okay, talking about interactivity, I would be interested in, on a scale from 1 to 5, how much value do you think you're actually getting out of the contract that you have? So if you have several contracts, just think of one, and then think of a number. If you get very low value out of this contract, give it a 1. If you get excellent value out of the contract, give it a 5. So how much of the value you anticipated when you started the contract do you think you've actually received out of this contract? And Jade, I think we have prepared a poll question for that.
Yes, I'll just launch it now, and then you'll all be able to provide your answers.
Perfect. So this is the poll question here. If everyone can just quickly fill that in, hit the submit button, and then we hopefully get a result for all of the participants. Jade, I'll let you run this part again as well. We'll just probably wait a bit longer.
A couple more seconds. Nearly everyone's voted. Okay. And close. Okay, so We received 33% of you or said that you got little value from your contracts. 44% were sort of okay value, and 22% of you were good value. None of you, luckily, have said you get very poor value, and unfortunately, though, none of you are getting excellent value either.
Okay, excellent. So to me, that shows most of the people probably sit sort of in the middle of this sliding scale here, you know, that probably shows why you're attending the webinar, because you want to know how you can get more out of your service providers, really. So that's great. Now I'd be also interested in seeing why you think you're not getting quite the value out of this contract. What are the sort of sticky points? And based on that, I can then probably tailor some of the future webinars to really address those issues. Let's spend a couple of minutes on this one here. This is the little boy that's really frustrated. If I could get you to write in your questions pane, just down 3 reasons why you think your contract doesn't achieve as much value as it could. So why is your contract only halfway sort of on that scale that we just had? Why did you give it the score that you have just given it? All right, so just write it in your questions pane. I'll give you 2 or 3, probably even 5 minutes to do that, and I'll talk to the responses as they come in. All right, there's already a few coming in. I encourage everyone to participate. It's going to make it definitely more relevant for you when the other webinars come up. Why is your contract not achieving as much value as it could? That's the question. Still some coming in. That's excellent. I'm just going to wait another minute or so, and then we move on from there. Okay, perfect. Great. Thank you, everyone, for putting in some really good questions. So I'm just going to go through the sort of list. Quite a few people struggle with the clarity of specifications of service level agreements. This one person actually said the specifications were written by us, so we weren't clearly sort of communicating our expectations with the service provider at the time of the tender, for example. There's also unclear accountability for contract management. So again, I think that is an internal thing. So who is really accountable for managing a contract? That's a really good question, which will be obviously different in every organization. There's no right or wrong answer. Important is that there is someone assigned to it, right? Changing goalposts through the life of the contract is another issue. So when we talk about variations later on in the webinar, I think that one will be definitely coming through again. Variations always have a bad reputation. They don't need to be as, there's not just bad variations, there's also good ones to actually make sure that those changing goalposts can be put into the contract, and again, to manage the expectations that come with that. Businesses are working outside the contract that's in place, so that sounds like that's probably written by a procurement person. The business just do whatever they want, and they probably don't even know what's in the contract, so they ask for out of scope work. Again, something that is typically covered through variations. Not enough time spent on understanding contracts that were handed over. Absolutely. So when someone walks in your office, gives you the contract, they don't even give you an introduction of what that contract is all about. then again going in the direction of incorrect KPIs, a lack of reporting or poor scoping, all stuff that we have already covered, poor communication, this person said is especially typical for IT people. Then there is a lower price offered by other suppliers. So that sounds like the procurement process. There was something wrong with that, not fleshing out the right value for money there. Then less knowledge on how to actually manage contracts. Contract managers are operational managers with a preference to get things done. That's a really good one. So we typically talk about contract managers being the ones responsible for getting the performance out of the service provider rather than getting things done. So being an escalation point, being a point of discussion with someone in the organization that's removed from day to day. We'll talk about that when it comes to the setup of the contract, what you can do around your governance structure to ensure that. Then again, unclear KPIs, ever-expanding scope, that's a good one too. And this is especially a problem in professional services contracts, I guess. There is unreliable reporting of contract spend and an account manager that's treating different parts of organization differently, which is probably alluding to whoever screams most gets also serviced first, which is probably not the most professional way of solving issues, but there's probably also something that you can do as a contract manager to make sure that that is mitigated, that risk. Excellent. Look, I think there was a really good list of ideas here. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. It's much appreciated. Now, I want to move on to the next slide, if that is okay with everyone. If you do have any further questions, just use that question pane. Now everyone knows exactly how to use it, so that's an advantage of having this question here. So just let me know if you have any questions or raise your virtual hand. All right. So the next slide is really, or the next two slides, are talking about, okay, so now we talked about, why contract management and how you become a contract manager, but what is it? So what is contract management? And on this slide here, I've plotted the 7 steps of what happens throughout the life of a contract. Right? Some people say it's 11 steps, others say it's 5, others say it's 4. All of that is correct. I've just plotted it as 5. Now, it typically starts with planning a procurement. Right? So you have a bit of a view of this is what our need is, this is what the market can probably offer, these are probably some of the service providers out there. I have a bit of an understanding of all of these things, what are the capabilities, what are the requirements. Then that is often formalized in a procurement plan or in a procurement strategy, and you go to market. So you go to market, you put together a set of specifications that are hopefully very clear and not very gray, that hopefully have some sort of performance measurements in there, that hopefully have a governance structure around how you how you will manage the contract going forward, and then you engage the market, say through a tender process or an RFQ, request for quote. You get responses back, you evaluate those, you make a best value for money decision, and you award the contract to the best suited contractor. Now, when we talk in the next webinar around what you can do at this stage to make contract management more successful, we'll actually go into all of these 3 first steps again in a bit more detail and talk about at each step what are the sort of things that you need to be aware of to make sure that your contract can be ultimately successful. The blue bubbles on this slide, the implement, the manage, the review, and the decide on closeout or extension, that is actually what we traditionally call of being the contract management process. So the yellow bubbles were the sourcing process or the procurement process, and the blue bubbles are the contract management process. Now, implementing means the sort of first 3 months. How do I make sure that the contract is implemented in the right way, that all of my systems are set up to measure those KPIs? How is everyone aware of what is the scope of this contract? How is everyone aware of, is there a contract management plan? Who's the person to ask questions on both sides, actually? If you want to have regular performance review meetings with the service provider, this is the time to slot them in, to actually schedule them in the first 3 months. After that, it's more of a day-to-day management of the service provider. So this is around making sure that stuff gets done on your side. It's around risk mitigation. It's around continuous improvement. It's about keeping an eye on the service provider and ensuring the compliance with the contract. Review is the sixth bubble, and that one really talks about making sure that you get the performance out of the service provider that you need to get out of them. So making sure that this disappointment gap that we saw before is narrowed down to as much as possible, right? So that you get the actual performance up to where your expectations were at the beginning of this contract life cycle. And this is all about monitoring KPIs, but then also having the tough discussions. And the two webinars that we'll have on performance management will focus exactly on this review step. After that, it's a decision, the contract is up for expiry, and so typically contracts are, say, 5 years long, and they might have extension options in there. Those might have already been used up, and you might make a decision whether you want to go back out to market or if you just use the same contract and extend that contract. If you're in government, that's not always as easy as it sounds. What is important is that you leave yourself enough time at this stage to make a decision, because if you think about this too late, you make a decision by default. It basically means we don't have the time to step through the sourcing process again before the contract expires, so you're just going to extend the current contract. That is never a good decision. A decision by default, because we ran out of time, you're just going to have to put a new contract in place. That's never good, because things have changed over the life of this contract. So you want to make sure that you account for all of that. We've run a study 2 years ago now, and we asked leading Australian procurement organizations, how long does it typically take for you to step through those first 3 steps, the planning, the go-to-market, and the award? And overwhelmingly, they came back with saying it takes us 6 to 9 months. That is a very long time, and I'm sure some of you are a bit shocked by that. It's reality, and it's actually not too different from big private sector organizations to public sector organizations. So that's a sort of a benchmark. A complex procurement project takes 6 to 9 months. Again, it's important to have that in your mind. It goes to expectation management, and it also goes to leave yourself enough time to make that extension decision at the end of the contract, because you will need 6 to 9 months if you want to go back out to market. These 3 steps are typically facilitated by your procurement team, and the goal is to just have a signed contract. Right? As soon as a contract is signed, procurement goes away, and they throw it over the fence to you to manage. That's great, but then the real work actually even starts. Right? So contract management, as you see in this blue box, is actually way more difficult, because you don't just have to have a signed contract, you actually want to have a successful contract. You want to have a contract that performs to your expectations and to all of your stakeholders' expectations. When we talk about value for money, too often value for money is just assessed at that award stage and not at the end of the contract. It's all well and good if you want to get all of these savings out of a contract, all of these additional benefits that are non-monetary, but if you can't realize them over the life of the contract, which might be several years, then that is not a good outcome. Right? So active contract management is required to make sure that those benefits are materialized, they materialize over the whole life of the contract. All right, so you might have now a question around, okay, what is it that I actually need to do? Well, this is answering that. This slide is hopefully answering that. So throughout those first 3 steps of the previous slide, throughout the sourcing process, what is your responsibility? Well, your responsibility really is to make sure that the sourcing team, the procurement team, has enough knowledge about the subject matter as possible. So say you work in IT and you see someone running a procurement process that has a clear IT component to it, and you are not asked to be participating in the project working group. That is for you to then raise a red flag and say, well, you know what, guys, you need me on there because I know the market best. I also know our internal needs best, so I need to be having some sort of input into this procurement process. Too often, unfortunately, organizations run procurements and then only think about contract management as an afterthought once the contract was signed. It's very important that straight from the beginning, at that planning stage, at the very beginning of the life cycle of the contract, you actually think about how do you want to manage this contract going forward. And it's vital to have the subject matter knowledge available to that sourcing project. Next week, we'll see that, if you get anything wrong in the actual contract, you can never have a successful contract. So the subject matter expertise becomes absolutely critical. At the implementation stage, and now we're entering the contract management process, what you want to make sure is that there is a plan of how you want to manage the contract. It doesn't necessarily mean there needs to be a document that says, this is the contract management plan. What you want to make sure is that you have thought about it, that everyone is on board with their plan of how you want to manage the contract. You also want to make sure that appropriate resources have been assigned to manage the contract. So again, if you have someone manage the contract on your behalf, make sure that they are able to prioritize whatever they have to do to manage their contract over their other day-to-day work. Contract management is absolutely critical in the success of the delivery of the contract. So therefore, people need to be able to breathe and actually be able to have the time and to manage the workload that comes with contract management. We also want to make sure that there's appropriate transition arrangements agreed. So that means for the operations to commence, you might have to transition something from an old service provider to a new service provider, and the project management around that is an absolutely critical success factor for the overall success of the contract. If you don't manage your transition well, you're actually on the back foot from day one when the contract commences. So spending a lot of time and a lot of diligence there is absolutely vital for you to get a successful contract. The day-to-day management of the contract is the next step. So making sure that the service provider's responsibilities are tracked. So being aware of what do they actually need to do, and that everyone knows about that, the service provider as well as your internal customers. You also want to make sure that the goods and services are delivered as required. So this all goes to making sure that the compliance part with the contract is monitored. The budget needs to be tracked and payments need to be approved. That will be different from organization to organization. So what really this slide does is that someone needs to make sure these things happen, and typically the accountability stays with you. But feel free to obviously delegate this, right? So contract management is always a group effort, and it doesn't need to be all done by you, the contract manager. You also want to make sure that appropriate records are being kept, simply because if there is a bigger issue later on and you have to escalate it to someone, it's great to have, this is what the issue was, this is what we have tried to resolve it, and then as a result, this is not happening, so I need to escalate it. Before I go on to the next part, I've just seen a question pop up, so I'll just quickly jump in and answer that. Thank you for asking the question. So the question was, can you please give an example of up-to-date plan? So I think that goes into the implementation phase up there. So an up-to-date plan, if you work in government, you might have come across something that's called a contract management plan. It basically is a bit of a summary of the contract. It doesn't verbatim state exactly what was in the contract. It summarizes it quite often in plain English, quite often at a very lower level detail, at a higher level detail, not as detailed as in the contract, and it references, should you go through a variation process, this is the process that's set out and this is the corresponding clause in the contract itself. It also details things like who's the contact at the service provider, how often do we meet with the service provider. So the reason why you want to keep all of that up to date is that if you ever go on leave, a good contract management plan is one that you can easily hand over to the next person, and they can step in and manage the contract, know everything they need about that contract, such as what are the current sticky points, what are the current issues, and it ensures business continuity. I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, just ask a follow-up question and I'll get back to that. The next part is around review. So this is all around making sure that the performance of the service provider is monitored and also managed. If you have 50 KPIs in your contract, you spend all of your time measuring those KPIs and actually not managing the performance. So we'll talk about that in a later webinar, obviously. You want to make sure that the relationship is healthy and communication is effective, that variations are dealt with appropriately, and that there's clear processes how you raise and resolve issues so that they don't become personal and that they don't become a strain on the relationship. At the end, you want to make a decision of whether to close out this contract or if you want to extend it. You want to make sure that there's a robust and informed decision that can be scrutiny, and you want to make sure that the timing does not preclude the option to re-procure, because you gave yourself 3 months time. We just heard it takes 6 to 9 months to go through a procurement process. Well, you have made a decision by default. As we said, it's never a good decision. So basically this slide here, and you see the little tick boxes, this can almost inform you to see how well you are managing your contract and or how well your contract is managed. And for those of you who have already got the course book, because they signed up for the whole 7 parts of this webinar, on page 14, I believe it is, there is actually that checklist, and you can tick them off to sort of give yourself a little health check that would see how your contract is actually being managed. You will also see throughout the webinar series that we touch on every single one of these points on this slide and talk about in more detail what you need to do so that you can get a more successful contract. All right, so at this stage, I'd like to thank you very much for your participation today, and I'm very happy to take any questions. I think, Jade, you'll facilitate that if you're happy to do so. So please use the questions pane to ask the questions, or if you're comfortable, raise your virtual hand and I will hand over the microphone to you, and I'll try to answer the questions as well as I possibly can.
Oh, we've got one here. Can contract law be learnt by contract managers?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. Contract law, there's a lot of courses out there. A lot of the law firms offer those training courses. There's uni courses that you can do on contract law. What I'll actually argue in webinar 4, when we talk about the traps to avoid, is that contract law is something important, but it is actually not that important for managing a contract. Right? Contract management is all about relationship management. It's all about performance management. And those two together are sort of preventative. They act preventatively so that you don't ever have to go into a dispute, a formal dispute that may lead to legal proceedings. So contract management really, if it ever goes to the point where you have to know about contract law, something has gone wrong before. So we want to make sure that in the webinar we'll actually cover enough tools for you so that you can avoid actually being confronted with contract law. A lot of the people that I ask that question, have you ever been involved with contract law, they actually say no. I've never been in a course where someone even has been to court over a contract dispute. That just goes a long way of saying that the importance of contract law is probably a bit overstated. Do you have any other questions?
If you think of anything else after the webinar, feel free to email it to Stefan or myself, and we'll give you those details shortly. So thank you, Stefan, and thank you everyone for attending the first webinar of this series. If you have any other questions, like I said, please contact either Stefan or myself. As you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation. We'd appreciate if you will complete that and provide your feedback. In the next 24 to 48 hours, you'll receive an email with a link to view the recording and slides from today. If you joined us as a trial attendee today and would like to purchase an all-access pass for the rest of the series, as well as the contract management course book and other resources, simply visit our website. So that's about it. So on behalf of Grosvenor and our presenter, Dr. Stefan Gassner, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to your participation at the second webinar titled Setting Up a Successful Contract, and that will be held on Wednesday the 4th of May. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.